build in his poem Ulysses. Notice here he says, I hate the whole thing of traveling, but the fact is that men put up with misery to stuff their cursed bellies. This is a line which often readers go back to, and to the Iliad. You'll remember, after Patroclus has been killed, Achilles is ready to join the fighting force and go immediately into battle, and it's Odysseus who says, what? Right. No, let's eat first. Here he says it. The fact is that men put up with misery to stuff their cursed bellies. For Odysseus, it's always about his belly, right? Always about his belly. He asks about his parents, right? Laertes and his mother. And the swineherder will tell the whole story point by point at line 391. He says it. Laertes is still alive, but night and day he prays to Zeus, waiting there in his house for the life bread to slip away and leave his body. This is interesting too, because it builds suspense for when Odysseus is finally going to be reunited with Laertes, his father, later in the poem. Of course, one more time Odysseus is reminded by Eumaeus that Odysseus' mother died out of a broken heart because Odysseus was gone. Ouch, that would be even harder, right? Then Eumaeus is going to tell his story. He says, in fact, I grew up with your sister, with Odysseus' sister, right? And then he says, you know, they took very good care of me, but he pauses at line 420 and says, you know, Penelope doesn't take very good care of me anymore because she's so fed, always consumed with these stupid suitors. And it then leads Odysseus to ask at line 430, who are you? He says, where do you come from? Tell me your story. Again, this idea, I began our time together in AP by saying this. We are the stories we tell, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. And here we are again. Tell me your story, where you come from. In some ways, you could make the argument that our whole life is nothing but the exchange of stories. And everyone you meet has a story. And that story, of course, has both pleasure as well as pain, doesn't it? Just like all of our in our stories, right? Notice the swineherd comes back and he says at line 438, so many, you really want my story? So many questions. Well, listen in quiet then and take your ease. Sit back and drink your wine. The nights are endless now. We've plenty of time to sleep or savor a long tale. I often will point out to students when we hit this line that we often forget the Odyssey wasn't assigned in some school. The Odyssey was a poem, like the Iliad, for entertainment purposes. And notice here, he says, why don't you sit back, have a glass of wine, and I'll tell you a really good story. And of course, if you're listening to this, and you're not worried about having to pass some stupid test or something on it, you're just listening to it, you're like, yes, tell me another story. I love that, right? He says, we too will keep to the shelter here, eat and drink, and take some joy in each other's heartbreaking sorrows, sharing each other's memories. This is, of course, a big deal for Odysseus because he's been alone on an island for 7 years with Calypso. Over the years, you know, he says at line 450, a man finds solace even in old sorrows. True, a man who's weathered many blows and wandered many miles. My own story? This will answer all your questions. He starts with place at Syri. He grows up, he says, in a beautiful place, never had any kind of hunger. It was amazing. Kind of like Phaeacia, he says, death came gentle on everyone. He said, my father was a king. Then the Phoenicians landed. We see Phoenicians again factoring into the story as being kind of dangerous. There's a guy who, a Phoenician sailor, who seduces the woman who is kind of the caretaker for Eumaeus, right? Again, notice women here are the source of pain. We've seen this mantra before, right? He says, I was taken away. The idea here is that it's always women and their hateful plans that that will always kind of hurt us in the end, right? Beware of women, again the mantra, right? The sailor becomes her secret lover. He invites her to sail away with them. She says, swear me an oath you're not going to hurt me. They do. The woman hatched a plan at 490, right? She says, this is what we'll do. You come in, you tell me when it's time to go, and I'm going to steal some stuff from the house of the king, and I'm even going to give you the boy as well, which is obviously Eumaeus, and you can sell him off. So Eumaeus is kidnapped. This is a common storyline, right? Where the young boy is left alone, right? And off he goes on his adventure. Again, there's always a story behind the story, right? That is to say, the woman will say, let's keep it secret, and then we can fool everyone. Now, of course, some of this mirrors what's going to happen at the end of the Iliad, or at the end of the Odyssey in Book 22. Same gig, right? In some ways, it's like the Trojan horse all over again. So, sure enough, she's inside the court. Somebody comes in and gives her the sign. She steals some gold. She steals young Eumaeus. She gives them to the boy, and and off we're told he goes at line 525. She snatched up 3 goblets, and I tagged along, lost in all my innocence, and along he goes, right? The woman dies as they're sailing. The child is completely alone, cowering, sick at heart at line 538. And then Laertes, the king of Ithaca, the father of Odysseus, bought him, he says, and at line 540, the royal King Odysseus answers warmly, Eumaeus, so much misery, you've moved my heart deeply with your long tale, such pain, such sorrow, true. But, he says, Odysseus, look at the good fortune God sends you, hand in hand with the bad, reminding us, of course, of Achilles speaking to Priam in Iliad 24, and Zeus's 2 jars, one of great things, one of pain. After all your toil, you reach the house of a decent, kindly man who gives you all you need in meat and drink. He's seen to that, I'd say. It's a fine life you lead, better than mine. Well, whether it's a fine life or not, I mean, the guy sleeps with pigs, right? But this is Odysseus' way to say, hey, at least you're alive, right? So we're told guest and host confided through the night until they slept, a little at least, not long, and then dawn rises. Telemachus is back in Ithaca. They eat. He says, I'm off to Eumaeus' hut. He says to the sailors, I'll pay you tomorrow to take care of it. Theoclymenus will ask, where do I need to go? I guess I'll go to the palace. And it will be Telemachus that says, no, don't go to the palace. Especially beware of Eurymachus. He is a seriously bad guy. The prince of the suitors, we're told at line 583, hottest to wed my mother, sees my father's power. But God knows, Zeus up there in his bright Olympus, whether or not before that wedding day arrives, he'll bring the day of death on all their heads. Again, the poet giving us this foreshadowing, this sense that something really major is going to happen in book 22. Then we have a second sign. A hawk comes by with a dove, and immediately Theoclymenus will give the insight, the meaning, the interpretation. Look, he says at line 594, look, the will of God just winged that bird on your right. Why? The moment I saw it here before my eyes, I knew it was a sign. No line more kingly than yours in all of Ithaca. Yours will reign forever. So in other words, he tells Telemachus that after your father Odysseus was king of Ithaca, you will become king of Ithaca, and your sons will continue to be king of Ithaca. Telemachus finally will ask Pyrrhus if he will take care of Theoclymenus, that is to say, show proper Xenia. And then on his way he goes, striding briskly at line 620, legs speeding him on till he reached the farm where his great droves of pigs crowded their pens, and the loyal swineherd often slept beside them, always the man to serve his masters well. And we're ready then for the first of several recognition scenes, as we will call them, knowing that Odysseus is about to meet his boy. All right, let's turn now to levels 2 and 3 quickly. At 2A, well, I think this is important, so let's say it. We all have a story, don't we? And we all seem to long to want to share that story at times in our life, and other times not share that story at times. Notice as well, we're all kind of defined in that story by how much adversity we overcome, isn't it? Of course, let's also point out another major clear message theme of this book is a good story understands how to create suspense. We can't wait for book 16 because Telemachus is going to meet his father and Odysseus is going to meet his son, and that's going to be a pivotal moment after 20 years of being gone. It's going to be remarkable. In the end, another message is things work out for people. For the Greeks, this was a firm belief. Things work out for people who respect the gods, right? At level 2B, the symbolism of Helen's robe cannot be overstated, right? I mean, again, from Iliad 3:150, giving it to Telemachus, that's compelling, right? The symbolism, of course, is going to represent for this robe the circle of life in years, right? So there she was, behind the walls of Troy, weaving that robe. She brings it with her back. Now, years later, she's ready to hand it off to Telemachus. Of course, the other symbolism that's self-evident are the birds that's going on, right? So you've got eagles jacking goose. You've got hawks jacking doves. Of course, the eagles and the hawks representative are symbolic of Odysseus, by extension Telemachus, and of course, goose and dove, that would be the suitors, right? That's all taking us towards book 22. We'll get there. The irony that we're always looking for it to be, well, it is kind of interesting, isn't it? Eumaeus comes from royalty, and now he takes care of pigs. Life is strange in that way, right? You never know. Right? Odysseus, he ends up now as an old poor beggar, right? He grew up, notice the irony, as well as in Odysseus' house. In some ways, they are kind of brothers. They're like almost related in some way, right? At 3a, since we've mentioned the Iliad already, we'll talk one more time. Obviously, the Helen references here are important. It's almost like we're coming to the end of the cycle, right? With the judgment of Paris so long ago, pre-Iliad, right? We had the beginning of it all. That is to say, Paris with Helen. And now we're coming to the very end of the story, and Helen's back again. Who's given the last words of the Iliad? That is right, Helen, right? So, I mean, it's interesting that we keep coming back to her. Of course, this Iliad thing and the reading of bird signs, especially on the right for good luck, that's very Iliadic, isn't it? How about this one, though? Let's ask another question at 3a. What is your favorite story about a child who's kidnapped and abandoned, and then he's got to figure it out? Okay? Or orphaned, we might say. Dickens, or, Oliver Twist comes to mind. You can think of your favorite. Yeah, are there any video games that you play that play with that storyline as well? It's kind of a popular one, right? And I mean, just think about the ways in which that storyline permeates so much of our culture. If you're a Star Wars fan, just go back to who Luke's living with at the very beginning. Well, he's not living with his original parents. Well, yeah, he's almost like an orphan of a kind, isn't he, right? And there he is, trying to figure out who he is and what he's going to do. Finally, at level 3b, how are we going to relate to this? Well, think about this. The way that the stories are presented for us in the Odyssey, we get this sense that everything about our life is somehow patterned. So that, for example, today, if you pick up a biography, or even an autobiography of a famous person, usually it's going to be divided up into parts. Think about this. Do you yet, in your young age, see your life as already starting to have certain kinds of phases to it, right? And of course, we do this a lot in the Odyssey, right, where we're hearing these stories about first this happened, then this happened, then this happened. How will the history of your life story go? How will it end? This is an interesting speculative thought. Like, for example, when you are double your age, let's just call it 40, what kind of life story will you be able to tell? And how will you see it in terms of phases? Well, let's finish. What has happened in books 13, 14, 15 are all getting us ready, of course, for the action of books 16 through 22. Many have said that these books, 13, 14, 15, don't have a lot of action in them other than the stories that are told. And I would say about that, yeah, that's probably a good way to read it. But now we're going to begin to pick up with action, starting with, in the very opening scene of book 16, Telemachus shows up. Of course, Odysseus has got a problem. He's been told by Athena, whatever you do, don't let anybody know who you are. So Odysseus is going to sit in a hut and watch his own boy, who, when he left him, the kid couldn't walk. He was only crawling. 20 years later, there he is, and he walks through the door, and he will treat Eumaeus like a father. How's that going to fit for Odysseus? And think of the pain that will be involved in that, and of course the excitement, right? We're going to see these recognition scenes where Odysseus is going to reveal himself, intentionally or not, by the way, to a number of characters. And each time, put this in your notes, each time there is some kind of pain involved in this disclosure, right, and recognition. All right, let's turn to book 16, the famous recognition scene between father and son. By the way, I promised we would do this. We haven't been doing this a lot, simply because it's kind of arbitrary, because the poet didn't really divide the poem into books like we do today. But think of it. Iliad 16, we're about to hit Odyssey 16. Iliad 16 is the story, the Aristeia, the story, the war story of the great young Patroclus, right? Who has joined the battle and is now marching out to win his glory and his fame. We're going to see a lot of this mirroring action happening in books 16 through 22. So, for example, I can already predict for you what happens in Iliad 22 and what happens in Odyssey 22. Well, we'll come back to have some more conversation about that. Thank you.